Continuing my read through of the Bible, I now come to the book of Deuteronomy. So before I get started on this, I want to briefly apologize for my previous video, my review of the book of Numbers, in which I rambled on for over an hour and then got cut off abruptly because my camera phone ran out of storage after over an hour. So apologies, first of all, for rambling so much, and second of all, for the abrupt ending. I ended up not covering the last few chapters of Numbers and giving my thoughts on those, but upon reflection, I thought it's just as well. I mean, there is literally nothing I can say about the Bible that hasn't been said 1,000 times by other people elsewhere. It's the most commented upon book in the Western canon, perhaps in all of world literature. So we'll just go ahead and leave it there. Apologies for my inability to be succinct. And then related to that, I think what I'm going to do going forward is in this video and the subsequent videos, I'm just going to try and jump into my thoughts as quickly as possible without reintroducing the purpose behind this read through and without going into my backstory about growing up with the Bible and et cetera, et cetera. I'll maybe link. I've said it all in previous videos, so I'll link to all the stuff in the description down below if anyone's interested, and I'll just kind of assume at this point in the Bible reading, anyone who's following me along is maybe familiar with my story. Okay, so getting into Deuteronomy, this is the fifth and final book of what is known as the books of the law. Of course, as I've been saying, they're not entirely books of the law. There is narrative mixed in with that. So Genesis was mostly narrative. Exodus was about half and half narrative, half books of the law and descriptions of the tabernacle. Leviticus was almost all law. There was one or two little stories mixed in. Numbers was about half and half narrative, half law. And then we get to Deuteronomy, which is all law, kind of. There is some recap of the story so far. So there's a recapping of the narrative, but no new narrative incidents in here. Now, my own personal preference is for the historical narrative of the Old Testament. When we get to the sections on, I don't know, I'm just kind of a history narrative type buff. The laws bore me. I have to fight to keep my eyes from glazing over. So this was not my favorite book to read through, but the good news is, now that I'm done with Deuteronomy, we have a nice long stretch of narrative coming up. So Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Samuel, Kings, and after that we get to Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah. And then, because I'm reading the Catholic Bible, we've got even bonus books of narrative coming up with Judith and Tobit and 1st and 2nd Maccabees. So looking forward to all of that, but let's go through, talk about the last book of the law first. In the recap of the narrative, there are a couple of things that are making me reevaluate what I said in my review of Numbers, and I'll just go through these briefly, or go through them at least. First one is Israel's relation with Edom and Moab. Now, in the book of Numbers, Israel wanted to go through Edom's territory. Edom refused, and so Israel went around Edom's territory instead of through it. In the book of Deuteronomy, the same event is recalled, but in this case, they passed through Edom's territory, so they did not go around. So this brings me to a map that I was showing when I was doing my review of Numbers, in which, as I was talking through this map, I pointed out that there were two different possible routes here, but couldn't really explain what was going on. And I think I said something like, there appears to be some discrepancy or something like that. That's the danger of filming these unscripted. You sometimes talk yourself into areas that you don't really know anything about. But I think that's what's going on here. I think that's why there are two different routes here. Because in Deuteronomy, it does look like they could pass through Edom. So I guess chalk this up to just one of the many discrepancies in the Old Testament. And by the way, the map I'm getting here is from the internet, but it's from a webpage called the History in the Bible podcast, which, if you click on this and look at this, it does look like this could be a really interesting podcast. I can't listen to it right now because my podcast listening dance card is already completely full, but maybe bookmark this for an interesting podcast to come back to later. It looks like they cover a lot of interesting stuff in there. Now, the other thing I realize I messed up a bit is, where is it? It recounts some of the stories from the previous books, and it recounts how Moses intercedes with God, which is something I talked about in my discussion of Numbers. But this recount has Moses interceding with God when they're receiving the Ten Commandments. So this is the golden calf incident. I completely forgot, and I should have known this, but I completely forgot, that Moses has to intercede with God twice. So the first time is the golden calf incident with the Ten Commandments, and then the second time is in Numbers when the Israelites get cold feet and don't want to invade Canaan when God tells them to. So in both times, God said he's going to completely destroy Israel and start over with Moses and make a new nation out of Moses. In both times, Moses pleads with God and says, no, don't do this. The other nations are going to think that you were weak, or that you betrayed your own people, or that you brought your people out of Egypt just to destroy them. Moses makes some sort of appeal to God's reputation with the other nations as his way of talking God out of it, and then God relents. And that structure happens both in Exodus and in Numbers. When I discussed that in Numbers, I completely forgot that the same event had happened in Exodus. It's something I knew, but I forgot. And this is part of the problem here is I got distracted from my reading project of the Bible. So I read Genesis, Exodus, half of Leviticus, and then I stopped for over a year before I came back to this read through of the Bible. So that is one reason why that wasn't so fresh in my memory. But apologies, it's something I should have caught, but I missed. Okay, so those two apologies out of the way. Let's just go through this and comment on a few things. So, like I said, this is a recap of some of the events already mentioned in the Exodus and Wandering in the Wilderness storyline, with, it looks like a few contradictions and a few added details. So, like I said in my discussion on Numbers, the fact that Og, king of Bashan, is a giant is never mentioned in the book of Numbers, but that's a detail that comes up in Deuteronomy. We also have the Ten Commandments listed here. So this is, I believe, the second time the Ten Commandments are listed, one time in Exodus, one time in Deuteronomy. Wikipedia, I was checking that just now. Wikipedia says it's mentioned twice in Exodus, so maybe it's the third time it's listed. I don't remember. But at any rate, the Ten Commandments are recounted in Exodus and in Deuteronomy. Now, if memory serves, the late Christopher Hitchens and other skeptics used to make a big deal about the fact that there are two versions of the Ten Commandments. So, like, oh, you want to display the Ten Commandments in the schools? Well, which version? There are two versions. Did you know that there are two versions of the Ten Commandments and that they are different? Used to be a kind of big atheist thumping point. And they are slightly different, but only slightly. I've done a little bit of a brief comparison here. And by brief, I just mean kind of a skim my eyes over both versions. And it's pretty much the same, just the wording is a little bit different. I double checked this on Wikipedia, and Wikipedia says, yeah, they're pretty much the same, just the wording is a little bit different. So I suppose this would only be a real theological issue to you if you were really hung up on the every word has to be exact view of inerrancy in the Bible. Otherwise, it is pretty much the same here. And then we get into the Deuteronomic Code, or however you pronounce that. Now, another little detail I picked up through the internet. Deuteronomy is based on a Greek word, which means the second law. So we've already had one law. Here is the second law. Now, an interesting thing I've picked up from some of the biblical scholarship I've been reading and listening to, I think particularly Christine Hayes in her lectures on the Old Testament from Yale Open Courses University, points out that this is actually a different code than the code that's in Leviticus. So it's not just supplemental laws, it's a completely different code, and in some cases, the laws given here actually contradict the laws that are given in Exodus. Now, I would never have picked that up on my own because you don't as a casual reader, right? I mean, you're fighting just to keep from falling asleep as you're reading through these. And even as an adult kind of rereading this, I remembered what Christine Hayes has said, but I could not hold the Code of Leviticus in my active memory. So I could not compare these as I read them. I mean, I suppose I could have if I made a list of all the codes in Leviticus and compared them to the list of the codes in Deuteronomy, but I'm not going to do that. The project I'm doing is a casual reading of the Bible. I'm not making any pretenses to doing a serious study or scholarship of this. So I'm just going to have to say that according to other scholars, some of the codes in Deuteronomy contradict some of the earlier codes given in Leviticus, but I can't remember which one is which. And yes, it is all on the internet. So if we go over to Wikipedia here, the Deuteronomic Code, I think Deuteronomy calls the code in Leviticus the priestly code. Sorry, Wikipedia. Yeah. So there's a priestly code in the Deuteronomic Code, and they have comparisons here where it is similar and where it is different. So if you want to go kind of pick out all the differences between the two codes here, it's that information is available for you. I certainly cannot remember it. Now, let me back up here slightly and talk about the history of the book of Deuteronomy as I understand it. Based on, again, Christine Hayes and Robin Lane Fox and some of the other biblical scholars I've read or listened to. Which is that the narrative of the Exodus and the wilderness and the conquest of Canaan is not historical. It's all, or maybe mostly all, just mythology. But the historical narrative of the Old Testament does have some real historical events in it, namely the fall of Jerusalem and the Babylonian exile and the return from exile. That is all historical. And the Bible was written, the Old Testament narrative was written, or at least it was edited during that period. And so to understand what's going on in the Old Testament, you have to understand that the whole Old Testament is shaped by this traumatic event of Jerusalem falling, the Israelites, or the kingdom of Judah, I guess at that point, being led into exile, and the feeling that God has abandoned them and they've been forsaken, and looking back to how did God let this happen. It is, if I can go off on a brief tangent here, my understanding is that this is not uncommon in world history. I was at one point reading a history of Thailand, which talked about how when one of the northern capitals of the Thai kingdom was sacked by some of Thailand's enemies, it led to some soul searching about how did this happen. And they also blamed it. They said, we haven't been religious enough. And so it led to a revival in the religious codes in Thailand. I think it's not uncommon that when a country suffers a huge disaster, try and figure out what happened, why did God let this happen, where did we go wrong. But in this particular event in world history, this, because of the huge influence that the Bible has gone on to have, this is obviously, I guess, the most famous instance of this happening in world history. So the editors of Deuteronomy, I guess the code the code that they're using is from an older source. But the framework here that the editors are using is that if you follow these laws, God's going to let you prosper. If you deviate from these laws, then your enemies are going to come in and conquer you. And they're writing this with historical hindsight from the perspective of being in captivity in Babylon, or maybe returning from exile. And that historical framework is going to inform the whole, not the whole, but large portions of the following historical narrative, from Judges and Samuel and Kings. When you follow God's law, you prosper. When you deviate from God's law, your enemies will conquer you. So I mentioned that to say that there's some descriptions of war and exile to come. Now, it's given in the form of prophecy, but I think the general consensus is that it's highly likely that this is kind of being written after the fact. Meaning, it's interesting to speculate how much of this is eyewitness accounts of the siege, or maybe written in the generation afterwards or something like that. But talking about the hardships that Israel had suffered during the siege and captivity could, I think, well be based on firsthand or secondhand, maybe one generation removed possibly, sources. So during the siege and in the distress to which your enemies will reduce you, you will eat the fruit of the body, the flesh of those sons and daughters of yours whom Yahweh has given you. The tendered and most fastidious among you will glower at his brother, even at the wife he cherishes, and at the children that are left to him, grudging them a share in the flesh of those children of his that he has eaten. For during the siege and in the distress to which your enemies will reduce you in all your towns, there will be nothing left to him. The tenderest and most fastidious woman among you, so tender, so fastidious that she has never ventured to set the sole of her foot to the ground, will glower at the husband she cherishes, even at the son and her daughter, and hide from them the afterbirth of her womb, and the child she bears to eat them. So utter will be the destitution during the siege and in the distress to which your enemies will reduce you in all your towns. So a very horrific view of the hunger and suffering caused by the siege of Jerusalem, which, again, my understanding is that this might be historical witness. So that is just horrifying to contemplate what that generation went through. But I guess that's that's history for you, huh? A lot of terrible stuff went down when you read history, and that's one of the more visceral passages Is visceral the right word I'm looking for? Visual passage, one of the more lifelike passage, but those those ideas are kind of influenced all throughout a lot of this here. Then we get to the Song of Moses, the death of Moses. Moses blesses the tribe. Yeah. There is, once again here, what looks like there would be a lot of interesting historical detail in here if I knew anything to be able to ferret it out. I mean, I would love to read a version of this with more extensive notes. So there are some notes here. So, for example, it says that there's a blessing for each tribe. It says, of Benjamin, he said, the beloved of Yahweh, he rests in safety. The Most High protects him from day after day and dwells between his hillsides. Well, what does that mean? Well, according to the footnote, the blessings given to the tribes are allusions, though some are obscure in their future enjoyment of the promised land. Benjamin's hillside is Jerusalem. So dwells between his hillsides is an allusion to Jerusalem. And it lists off a few of the other allusions here, but doesn't come close to explaining everything that's going on here. For example, it says, Dan was on the borders of Bashan, Naphtali's sea. So of Dan, he said, Dan is a lion cub leaping from Bashan. Okay, so Bashan means it's on the borders of Bashan, but why is Dan a lion cub? What is that an allusion to? I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of fascinating historical details mixed in here, but who knows? I guess while I'm talking about the tribes of Israel, it might be helpful to get up my map here. This is from Wikipedia. But this is something that, again, I meant to talk about when I was talking about numbers, but ran out of time. This is I think the best guess of what the kingdom of Israel looks like. Now, where this comes into our narrative so far, they are on the hills of Moab, I believe, wherever that was. I guess possibly in the nation of Moab. In the book of Numbers, here, and here has already been conquered. So I guess the promised land is the area on the other side of the River Jordan. This is not the promised land, but while they were passing through there, they conquered the nations that were there, and then the tribe of Reuben and Gad asked to stay there. Moses asked God, and God said, okay, it's okay, they can have that land as long as they help the other tribes conquer the promised land. Conquest of the promised land, I think, is going to start in the next book, the book of Joshua. But already, according to this narrative, Reuben and Gad have settled into their territories. And this is something that I always thought was a little bit interesting, because it's one of those things that's mentioned in the Bible a few times but never explained. The half-tribe of Manasseh. So it talks about this in Numbers briefly, and it gets mentioned, I think, a couple times in Deuteronomy. It looks like you can see from this map, Manasseh is big, for one thing. I mean, you compare it to the other tribes, and it looks like a huge territory comparatively. But split down by the River Jordan. And it refers to the half-tribe of Manasseh wanted this land, which is not part of the promised land. It's on the outskirts of the promised land. And it talks about Reuben and Gad petitioning to keep this land here. And then after God says okay to Reuben and Gad, then the narrator just kind of adds in the half-tribe of Manasseh as an addendum, like, oh yeah, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. So like a lot of other things in the biblical narrative, it's just not explained. And so scholars are just left to guess, what does that mean, the half tribe of Manasseh? But I guess the guess is Manasseh was split into two parts by the River Jordan. And although they were the same tribe, each half was largely independent of the other half, and just kind of only loosely joined into one tribe. I don't know. I find these little historical details fascinating here. So this is one of the little things that interests me. I suspect I'll be coming back to this map as I get more into Joshua and the conquest of Canaan. So I think that's all I wanted to talk about. I mean, I don't know. There's a lot of other stuff in here. If we wanted to go through it, the code. Oh, there was something in the code that I found a little bit interesting, and this is hesitates to mention this because I always say, okay, I'm not going to go into Christopher Hitchens mode here and point out all the problems with the Bible, but this struck me. It says, a single witness cannot suffice to convict a man of a crime or offense of any kind, whatever the misdemeanor. The evidence of 2 witnesses or 3 is required to maintain the charge. If a malicious witness appears against a man to accuse him of rebellion, you have to have others. So it's established quite clearly the problem of relying on a single witness for anything kind of life or death, because witnesses can be malicious, witnesses can be lying, so you need 2 or 3 of them. If you have 2 or 3 of them, you're relatively safe, but if you've just got one guy, you can't trust him because people lie all the time. Now that struck me because after having read Thomas Paine's book, The Age of Reason, Thomas Paine bases his whole skepticism of the Bible on the fact that single eyewitnesses are unreliable. People have been known to lie all the time. I also remember reading the Christian apologist book, Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, in which Lee Strobel argued repeatedly, well, you have to believe it. We have eyewitness testimony that Jesus actually did this. Now, putting aside the fact that the Gospels are probably not the eyewitness documents that Lee Strobel wants to claim that they are, it's just interesting that right within the Bible we do have the acknowledgement that a single eyewitness is not always reliable, which of course raises the question of, how do we know any of this is reliable, right? How do we know that the book of Deuteronomy is reliable? Because somebody told us that Moses said it. Well, who told us? How reliable are they? Do we have 2 or 3 witnesses to collaborate that this is actually the word of God? It's an interesting law code to be put into a book. The authority of the book, in a case which the authority of the book is completely reliant on our assumption that it comes from a worthy witness. And that is all I'm going to say about that. Anything else I wanted to comment on? I'm sure there's tons of other stuff to get into here, but that's all the stuff that strikes me in my memory just now. So I'm going to stop it here, and then on next to Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Samuel, and Kings, where I get into my favorite parts, the narratives.